This will be a review, but it's always good to start at this kind of the same understanding, so that when we're talking about things like regulating, blood pressure, we can understand how it is important in the larger picture of biology. So when we look at the properties of life, we can think about things that living organisms have that non-living substances do not. And so one of these that is important is what is called organization. Now we're going to talk about the hierarchy of biological organization in a minute. But when you think about organization, the fundamental unit of life is the cell. And so if we think at the cellular level, the cell has a plasma membrane that regulates what goes into and out of the cell. Okay. So it regulates its internal environment. So, coal and diamonds have an organization, a molecular organization. But when I'm talking about organization, I'm talking about regulating what comes into and what goes out of. And then at the multicellular level, we'll talk about how cells come together and interact with one another to form tissues and to also form organs. And so the cell is the fundamental unit of life. And it's kind of interesting because at one point in time on our Earth's, on the planet's history, cells were able to spontaneously arise from molecules that were in water, but they are not able to spontaneously arise today. So you wouldn't find, in water, this occurred in water, but you wouldn't find molecules organizing themselves into cells. And so it's kind of interesting to think that all the cells that are around today on the planet and that make up all these organisms all originated way back when cells first, like 3 billion years ago, when cells first formed on the Earth's surface in water. And so that gives us kind of some unity, because all cells are derived today from pre-existing cells. So you have this lineage going back in time, a very, very long time. You have this cell lineage, and that is what is called the cell theory. Okay, so with this organization comes the requirement for energy and materials from the environment. So energy and materials exchanged with the environment. Right. So in the terms of energy, we can talk about that high energy molecule like ATP. So ATP is used in cellular processes. So it can be used to make proteins. It can be used to, in terms of allowing muscles to contract, right? And so that is our ultimate form of energy that we use in our body, is ATP. Now, we also, when we talk about this high energy molecule, we actually produce this, animals do, through what is called cellular respiration. And the cool thing about cellular respiration is this actually explains why we have to breathe oxygen in and why we breathe carbon dioxide out. And it is at the cellular level that this is important. So if we look at a molecule of glucose, okay, and we combine it with oxygen, this is an oxidizing chemical reaction, what we will get, and this actually occurs most readily in the mitochondria of our cells, what we get is carbon dioxide as a waste product, so we breathe it out, and then we get water. right? And then we also get ATP. And depending upon, generally it's 36, they say 36 to 38 molecules of ATP are produced for every glucose. And the reason why I have these sixes out in front is that this makes it so the chemical formula is balanced from one side to the other. So if you look at here, there's 6 carbon. There's 6 carbon here in this molecule of glucose. So this is glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, and adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Okay, and so then if you look here, there's 12, right? Oxygen. Here there's 6, so there's 18. Here there's 12, and here's there's 6, and so they're 18. So this is just the reason why I put these numbers out in front, is because that's how many you would need in order to balance the same number of atoms on one side of the equation versus other. Okay. Okay, so cellular respiration. We can also talk about materials. So when we talk about materials, right, we can talk about proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. So if you were to eat a steak, right, it would have all of these in it, right? So complex foods, whole foods tend to have all of these types of, or we have the inside the cow's cells would be DNA, and we could break down that DNA and we could use it to build our own DNA, right? Fat, carbohydrates like starch, or excuse me, maybe glycogen would be what we would have. We wouldn't have starch in steaks, we'd have glycogen. And then, skeletal muscle is full of proteins, right? So these are nutrients, right, that we would need in order to build our own body. And we exchange them, right, with the environment. We also would need minerals. So an example of a mineral would be iron, which is necessary for hemoglobin formation. And then we also have vitamins. And vitamins tend to be coenzymes. So we'll talk about enzymes when we talk about digestion and such. But enzymes help to catalyze chemical reactions. And so there are certain vitamins that are really important in catalyzing chemical reactions. Like vitamin C, right, is necessary for proper skin formation. Vitamin D is necessary for proper bone formation, right? And so vitamins are important as coenzymes, okay? So this is all under, right, this property that we interact with our environment and we exchange energy and materials with our environment, okay? Okay, so we're organized. Maybe we'll put numbers here. 2, we have energy, right? We respond to our environment. The third thing that's unique about living organisms is that we reproduce, we grow, and we develop. And we'll talk more about this when we get to sexual reproduction. But cell division that produces egg and sperm, right? The egg and the sperm come together to form a single cell. So we all start out as a single cell. And then that single cell undergoes cell division, type of cell division called mitosis. And then it develops into a multicellular embryo, which ultimately becomes a whole new individual capable of reproduction. Okay. The fourth thing is that living things have unity and diversity. So it's kind of interesting when we think about the unity, that would be like going back to the fact that all cells today arise from pre-existing cells, but we can also look at our genetic material. So if you were in biology 211 last quarter, you might have learned about the genetic code, which determines what sequence of nucleic acids or nucleotides codes for a particular amino acid. And so we say here that the genetic code is universal. So this would just be an example of unity. The genetic code is universal, which means that you can take a gene from one organism like a bacteria and you can put it into a plant and the plant can read it. So we have this genetic code that a human gene could be put into a goat and the goat's cells would be able to read it. And so it's universal. So the genetic code is universal. Okay. We also see that there's diversity. And so we see that over time, species have changed, right? So organisms change over time. And one place that we see this, for example, is in the fossil record. And we'll talk about evidence for evolution and some examples of observing how organisms have changed by looking at the history of fossils in the fossil record. Okay, so those are just some examples of this property of life, okay, that we need to maintain. Okay, so most of you are probably familiar with the hierarchy of biological order, and there's a diagram of this in your book. But when we look at the most fundamental unit of matter, and matter is everything that has weight, we have atoms. So the most common type of atoms in our bodies could be remembered by the mnemonic device SCHNOPS. And so this is carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And so you probably learned that organic molecules have a carbon backbone, and then they have these other elements covalently bonded onto the carbon backbone. And that is important because we are composed of organic molecules. And so we're going to talk about, you know, all kinds of organic molecules when we start to get to physiology. Right? Okay, so then we have molecules. And molecules in biological terms are anything that contains more than one type of atom. So we don't generally talk about compounds in biology like they do in chemistry. And so molecules would be like, for example, glucose. Okay, so this is glucose. This is a monosaccharide that is found in our blood and is regulated in our blood very precisely, or rather precisely, so that we don't become hyperglycemic or hypoglycemic. So we have the molecules, then we have the cells. Okay, I also want to put enzymes here, because oftentimes people talk about enzymes as being living, but enzymes are not alive because molecules are not alive, because this is the transition to life, right? Is at the cellular level, we have things that are alive. Molecules are not living. So when they say that, what they really mean is that enzymes are active, meaning that they can be used to break down substances, but they're not alive. Sometimes they say live cultures, and that means generally live bacteria and yeast. So in yogurt, you would have live cultures. You don't ever have live enzymes, okay? So then we have cells. Next, we have tissues, and we're going to talk about tissues. Tissues are groups of cells with a common form and function. Right? So for example, we could talk about smooth muscle tissue as opposed to cardiac muscle tissue or skeletal muscle tissue. So this is just an example, smooth muscle tissue. And so we have many cells that act together to allow for contraction. And so this would be like, for example, in your stomach, right? So this is in the stomach, and it allows for the churning action. So it's the churning of the food and gastric juice. which does contain some enzymes, okay? So we would say that we have a smooth muscle cell, but all organized together, they become tissue, and then they would allow for this contraction and relaxation of the stomach that sometimes you hear when your stomach is stimulated to churn when your stomach is empty, and your stomach will growl because of that, okay? So those are tissues. When we look at organs, organs are composed of many tissue types. And so it's important to realize that the stomach is not just composed of smooth muscle, but it has nervous tissue in it. It has blood vessels in it. It has epithelial tissue lining it, and epithelial tissue on the outside, right? So it has many different types of tissues. So the stomach is an organ. Okay, smooth muscle tissue would be tissue. So then we have systems. And this is where we generally talk about the organs as in their different systems. And so when we talk about the organs, we can say that we have the digestive system, and this contains more than one type of organ. We'll put digestive system. So this includes, for example, the esophagus, stomach, liver, etc. Okay, so all those organs that are involved in digestion would be in the digestive system. And then we have the organism. Now you will learn that there are animals that do not have systems or lacking systems, that do not have organs, and that sponges, for example, are animals that actually lack tissues. So we can talk about the organism. So the organism is capable of reproducing. A new individual. Okay, so sponges are organisms, but they do not have these levels that we just talked about. They are only consist of specialized cells, no tissues. Then we can get into the realm of ecology, right? How organisms interact with each other and their environment. And so we're going to spend some time talking about ecology, but ecology is specifically going to be discussed in the next quarter. So I'm not going to talk about the different levels of ecology specifically here. Okay. We have molecules, right? This one doesn't have, I think maybe I cut it off. Then we have cells, and this is from your book. Then you have tissues. Then you have organs. And then ecologically, we have populations and communities and ecosystems, and then the whole planet, which is referred to as the biosphere. Okay. So I just want to talk about a little bit about two different ways that we could go about studying organisms and biology in general. And the first is reductionism. And reductionism generally means that we break down things into their smallest component in order to understand them. Okay, so you break down something, whether it be like an organ, like a stomach, right? That you break down something into its smallest components to understand it. Right? So if we're talking about the brain, we might look at individual neurons and how they are connected to one another. Okay. And when we talk about disease, like when we talk about heart disease, sometimes we only look at the circulatory system instead of potentially looking at the immune system or the nervous system or the endocrine system and how it could interact with it. So this is very powerful, and this is the way, in most cases, Western science goes about doing things, is breaking them down into their smallest components to understand it. okay? So this is the difference between holism, and they're actually can be used together, but I think that this is where biology, you have to understand, is kind of in its infancy, because we're trying to put everything back together and understand how everything interacts, and especially ecology, you know, is in its infancy in terms of we've reduced everything down. Now, how does it all work together, okay? So holism is understanding the whole. The bigger, we'll put bigger picture, right? And when we talk about holism, oftentimes what's really important are what are called emergent properties. And emergent properties are things, characteristics that are not found in the individual pieces, but only show up when you put those pieces together, okay? So characteristics that are not present in the smaller components, but only appear in the whole structure. Okay, so for example, when we look at digestion, right, we could talk about muscle and how important it is to churn, but the digestive system also has, the stomach has glands in it, and also, weirdly enough, the digestive system has its own nervous system that seems to also regulate mood. And so when we're looking at like when people have depression, you know, we might just be studying the neurotransmitters in their brain. But what about if when we're studying depression, it has something to do with their gut, their stomach, and their digestive tract, and the microorganisms that live in the digestive tract could affect a person's mood and could make it more likely that they're going to become depressed. And so the idea here is that you have to kind of put everything together, back together. And so you not only look at, when you're talking about the digestive system, you can't just look at the digestive system, you also need to look at the nervous system, the immune system, the circulatory system, and how it all comes back together. And so this is where, you know, in the Eastern philosophy and religions, it's more holistic and less reductionist. And so if we can kind of take what we've learned from reductionism and then put it back together into holism, this is where things might start to become very interesting. Okay, so hopefully you'll see that even when we're just, you know, only focusing on one system in the chapter, in the book, but they're related to other systems. I just want to point out that there are those connections. Okay, so we need to talk a little bit about diversity and unity, and this falls in the realm of evolution. And so evolution is a well-developed scientific theory that explains the pattern of life that we see appearing on the earth, starting with cells, and then multicellular organisms, and then insects, and then fish, and then reptiles, and then mammals. Okay, so for example, just looking at the progression of life that we see in the fossil record is a good evidence for evolution. But we're just going to simply define evolution as a change in a group of organisms over time. And microevolution specifically deals with a change in a population. So the video that you want to watch that talks about this is the rock pocket mice. So this would be example, rock pocket mice. Okay. Macroevolution is a change in a major group. So this would be a species or above. So we could have the evolution of a new species, for example, or maybe even the evolution of a whole new group of organisms like the reptiles or the mammals, okay? Species or above. Okay, so that is macro. So that's why it's called macro versus micro, okay? So macroevolution would include, so this includes speciation and evolution of new groups of organisms. So for example, the amphibians, an ancestral amphibian giving rise to reptiles. Okay, so that's an example of macroevolution. So when we look at the mechanisms of evolution, there are many that you might have talked about in previous classes, including things like genetic drift, gene flow, which is the movement of individuals between populations. You might have talked about the bottleneck effect or founder's effect, where you have just a few individuals from one population giving rise to a whole new set of individuals. But we're only going to pay attention to one mechanism this quarter, which is natural selection. So this is the mechanism. So this is how things change. And it's really only one example. Okay, so sometimes people argue about what is the most important mechanism for evolution. They, biologists generally don't argue over whether evolution occurs or not, because we all, pretty much agree that it does. It's little things like, what is the most important mechanism? Okay. So when we look at the mechanism of natural selection, we have some things that have to occur. So we can talk about these as being requirements. Okay. So one, right, is that there has to be variation between individuals. So variation, and this is genetic, we'll put genetic in parentheses here, exists between individuals. Right? So the variation is heritable. This variation is important because it can allow for selection, which is non-random. So variation arises through mutations. So I'll put here, arises through random mutations. And it's important to realize that this is where the randomness comes in. Okay, so organisms don't mutate towards a goal. So it's not like they needed to be a different color, so they mutated and became a different color. It's just as that the color variation was there to begin with, and so it can be selected for. Okay, so that's kind of a major misconception about natural selection. Okay, the other thing is that some individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce than others. I should have put survive and reproduce, but we'll put likely to, I'll put it here, to survive and reproduce than others. Okay. So this is what is referred to as selection. And this is non-random. So selection is non-random, but mutation is random. Okay. So when you watch that video on rock pocket mice, there are some questions that you need to answer for your homework that are in that PDF. And you print that out and you'll answer those questions. And some of that has to do with what's going on right here. Okay. Okay. So we're going to talk about biological species. And this is important because we can talk about this in terms of taxonomy. Now, the person who founded the father of taxonomy was Carl Linnaeus. You don't need to know that name, but Carl Linnaeus was around like a century before Darwin and Gregor Mendel did their work. And so Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s was not thinking that species changed. And so he was just interested in a filing system, like putting organisms together that looked similar, but he didn't think that they were all related. Okay, so when we talk about taxonomy, this is grouping organisms based on similarities. Okay. Generally, that has to do, in his case, with what they look like. So it'd be their morphology or their structure. So what the organisms look like, they were grouped into groups, okay? So we still follow that idea of taxonomy. And it's also important to realize that taxonomy changes. So like, for example, birds used to have to be in their own group. And now they've had to rewrite the entire textbooks because the scientists have decided that birds are actually reptiles. And so they are not separate from the reptiles. They are considered to be, birds are reptiles, and they're considered to be direct descendants of the dinosaurs. So when we look at the taxonomy, we can start at the largest grouping, and that is in animals. This is the kingdom. Sometimes it's different. It could be divisions if we're looking at bacteria or plants. So we start at the kingdom, and we're going to compare humans with cows because they're very similar, but they're classified slightly different. So you need to memorize kingdom, phylum, class, so the order of these, order, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then species. Okay. So humans and cows are both animals. So they are in the kingdom Animalia. Okay. Humans and cows both have a postanal tail, although it's greatly reduced in humans. And embryonically, they have a notochord, and they have a hollow dorsal nerve cord. And embryonically, we have pharyngeal gill slits. And so if you know what I'm talking about, the phylum would be that these guys are chordates. Well, actually, we'll put chordata. Chordata. And I'll just put, these are, cows are also chordata. Okay. Class. Both humans and cows have fur and hair or hair. They have subcutaneous fat. They have mammary glands. And so this would be mammalia. Okay. And so cows are also considered to be mammals. And so you notice that we're kind of breaking this down because, you know, kingdoms, all the animals are in kingdom Animalia. Only some are in the phylum Chordata, and even fewer are in the class Mammalia. Okay. So then we have the order. And so we have Primata. And then we have the hoofed animals, which is, this would be Artiodactyla. Okay. Then we have the family, right? So our family are the Hominidae. Hominidae. Now, a lot of species in our family have subsequently gone extinct. So if you think about Australopithecus, if you've taken anthropology, those are, that is an extinct group that would have been under family, but we are alone on our evolutionary tree branch. And some people think that it's not, that there's a reason why we're out alone on this branch. Like there's no other groups that are within this family but us around today. And that is because perhaps we outcompeted them, or perhaps we eliminated them because we couldn't survive with them, right? So hominidae, that's okay. So then Artiodactyl, this would be bovidae. And there's other bovids out there. Okay. Genus, Homo. This is Bos. Okay. Species would be Sapien. This would be Taurus. Okay. So when we see the binomial nomenclature of a species, this is the genus name, and what this is sometimes called the specific epithet, the species. So I would say that all humans around today are Homo sapien. They're actually Homo sapiens sapien because we're a subspecies, but I won't put that. And notice how I made this this capital letter, and I made this lowercase, because we always capitalize the genera, the genus, and we always lowercase the species name or the specific epithet. And then we always put this underlined or in italics, so that if you were reading a scientific paper, you would, this is the same Latin set of roots that is used to describe humans worldwide, okay? And so this one would be Bos taurus. Okay, so that's the domesticated cow. Okay. Okay, so that, you don't need to memorize these, but you do need to memorize these. So you need to know that phylum comes between kingdom and class, for example, and the most specific is the species. So when we look at biological species, this is really the only significant ecological definition, because really it's pretty fluid. Like I could move birds from class Aves into class Reptilia, and there's no reason why I did that other than the fossil record and DNA. But when we look at the biological species, the reason why it's so important is that this is how organisms are separated based upon their ability to reproduce or not. Okay, so I'm going to give you the definition for biological species. So individuals are of the same species if, right, they are capable, so individuals are capable of reproducing and producing viable, fertile offspring. Okay. So this is also really important, because if you think about conservation biology, it is the biological species that determines, that is actually listed as endangered or not. And so if you have two groups of birds, say for example, and they are the same species, but they're different subspecies, you can't really protect one versus the other one if one population is doing really well and the other population is dying off, right? You'd say, well, this one is over here is doing really well, so we don't need to protect this one because it would be okay for those to go extinct because that is of the same species, okay? So this idea of biological species is really important. So there are many things that keep species from reproducing, and you might have learned about this previously as well. And these are called reproductive isolating mechanisms. And I forgot my don't have my header here. So I'll just put reproductive isolating mechanisms. So these are things that keep species from reproducing. So there are many different things. So some of these are geography, right? So that would mean that their location, right? So where they live. They could also be behavioral. And this is a big one for animals like birds and also, lots of insects. This would be, for example, like courtship, right? So two birds could be isolated because one, the male is not providing the right courtship signals and the female is not willing to mate with him. So that would be a reproductive isolating mechanism. We also have temporal. So this is time. So they mate at different times of the year. Could be different times of the year. It could be different times of the day. So some crickets mate at night in the dusk, and some crickets mate in the morning. And those two groups would be reproductively isolated through a temporal mechanism. We also have mechanical. Okay. So mechanical would mean that perhaps the male's reproductive structure, the penis, would not fit into the female's reproductive tract. And this is sometimes referred to as the lock and key mechanism. And this prevents copulation, and that is where the male puts his copulatory structure into the female's reproductive. And this is actually big in insects. So a male damselfly or dragonfly might try to mate with a female, and he will not be able to insert his genitalia if it's not the right species. Okay. Okay, so then sometimes we get gamete failure of the gametes to recognize. So we get gamete separation. We'll put separation. I'm not sure that's not quite how I wanted to say it. Gamete separation. So this means that the copulation might have happened, or maybe it's actually out in the water. So the male releases his sperm, the female releases the eggs, and they just come together by floating together into the water. But if the sperm is not able to fertilize the egg, and there's chemical signatures on the egg and the sperm that make sure that only the right species of sperm fertilizes a particular egg. So the sperm cannot fertilize the egg. Okay. We could also have zygote inviability. Inviability means that they can't survive. So if the sperm does fertilize the egg, is there a viable embryo produced? So we would say that the embryo produced does not survive. And this can be due to differences in the chromosome numbers, because it appears that species tend to be different in the total number of chromosomes that they have. So like, for example, humans have a total of 46 chromosomes, but chimpanzees have a total of 48. So you would never be able to get a viable zygote cross between chimps and humans because they have different number of chromosomes. Sometimes we also have what is called hybrid sterility. So maybe two individuals are able to reproduce and produce an offspring, but that offspring is not fertile, so they are not able to reproduce. And so we would say that the offspring are infertile. And the best example of this is the donkey plus the horse, right? And they produce the mule, and the mule is almost always sterile. Okay, occasionally, and there's an explanation for that, but occasionally they are able to reproduce, but most of the time they are sterile. Okay, so these are things that keep species apart, right? They're reproductive isolating mechanisms. And so you should be able to give me some examples of a couple of these if it would appear on the quizzes, quizzes in class, or on the midterm or final exams. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and we are going to talk about mechanisms of macroevolution and speciation in the next lecture.